We are allocating the entire $60 billion buyout to Brandon, my father announced across the polished mahogany table, his tone as casual as if he were reading a weather report. Then he looked directly into my eyes, his expression completely cold. Now pack your personal desk items, Teresa. You are officially removed from the company. My mother smiled softly, taking a delicate sip from her china teacup. My older brother, Brandon, adjusted his custom diamond-encrusted cufflinks with a smug, satisfied smirk. The hum of the air conditioning unit overhead filled the heavy silence of the boardroom. I looked around the room, feeling the phantom burn of 8 years of quiet sacrifice, before asking the one question nobody at that table had anticipated. So, you finalized the sale of Vance Clean Tech without my core battery optimization algorithm patents? My mother gave a soft, condescending laugh. Teresa, sweetie, we sold our family business. Across the table, the lead buyer, Arthur Vance, CEO of Global Energy Dynamics, stopped writing mid-sentence. He slowly stood up, closed the leather-bound acquisition folder in front of him, and turned his gaze directly toward my father. That was the exact second I realized my family hadn't just betrayed me. They had catastrophically miscalculated everything. 8 years earlier, none of this looked dangerous. Back then, our family enterprise still felt small enough to be built on shared dreams. Our original office in San Jose, California, smelled like stale coffee, warm printer paper, and the citrus floor cleaner used by the night crew. My father, Richard Vance, wore the same charcoal suit to every pitch meeting. My mother, Eleanor, kept framed family portraits behind her desk to sell the image of a united household. And then there was Brandon. Brandon could walk into a crowded room of venture capitalists and convince them he was the smartest vision strategist in Silicon Valley within 5 minutes. I was the complete opposite. At 32, I was the engineer who preferred the quiet, isolated lab to the stage lights. I wore simple gray blazers, tied my dark hair back in a quick clip, and kept a worn blue grid-lined notebook right next to my keyboard. That notebook contained the original mathematical formulas, thermal calculations, and early architectural code for an AI-driven energy storage system, a technology that would eventually elevate our modest startup into a multi-billion-dollar acquisition target. I still remember the night the first prototype finally worked. I was 26, running on cold espresso, when the energy cells rebalanced under extreme pressure without short-circuiting. I laughed so hard my eyes watered. The following week, Brandon took the prototype to a tech summit in San Francisco. He was magnificent on stage. I'll give him that. He knew precisely when to pause for effect, when to smile, and how to translate complex thermodynamic math into punchy slogans investors could digest over drinks. When an investor asked how he developed the dynamic cell balancing algorithm, Brandon glanced toward the dark back row of the auditorium where I was standing in the shadows. For a split second, I thought he would point to me and share the credit. He didn't. He just smiled, bowed his head modestly, and said, "It took years of my relentless vision." Afterward, Mom squeezed my arm and whispered, "Brandon needs the spotlight for marketing, honey. You know you hate all that public attention." I swallowed my pride and told myself she was right. That became the toxic rhythm of our family. I built, Brandon presented, Dad negotiated, Mom polished the PR narrative, and with every milestone the company achieved, my name was quietly erased from the official history. Before Vance Clean Tech ever launched a single product using my algorithm, I had designed and patented the core architecture entirely on my own time, using my personal savings and independent lab equipment. A senior intellectual property attorney had warned me years ago never to sign over sole ownership just because it was a family business. So, I didn't. I granted the company an exclusive operational license to use the system, but I retained 100% of the underlying patents, along with a strict clause stating that any change in corporate control required my explicit written consent. At the time, they viewed it as routine administrative paperwork. They simply assumed I would always follow their lead. 8 years later, when Brandon started holding secret, closed door meetings with international energy conglomerates, and my calendar invitations mysteriously stopped arriving, I pulled that old blue notebook out of my desk drawer. For the first time, I realized they hadn't just forgotten I owned the tech. They were banking on me being too passive to enforce my rights. The first time I heard the buyout figure, I thought I had misheard. $60 billion. Dad brought it up during a Sunday family dinner, slicing into his prime rib as casually as if he were discussing quarterly inventory. Brandon sat across from me, swirling his vintage wine with a smug grin. The acquisition team sees immense long-term value in my architecture, Brandon boasted. Over the next 3 weeks, the closed-door sessions doubled. Brandon was copied on every legal draft. I was completely erased. Then, a massive compliance document landed in my inbox. Dad called it a standard administrative sign-off. I opened it at my kitchen counter late at night. The legalese was dense, but one specific clause jumped out: transfer of core IP and patent assignment consent. They needed my signature to hand over my patents to Global Energy Dynamics. The next morning, Dad leaned against my office doorframe with a forced smile. Just sign Section 4, Teresa. Legal needs to clear up the loose ends before Friday. Why am I considered a loose end, Dad? His warm smile vanished instantly. Don't make this simple transaction complicated, Teresa. That evening, Mom called. Brandon is under immense pressure, sweetie. This buyout is his legacy. Please don't turn this into some petty family ownership argument. An ownership argument. As if 8 years of original engineering, late nights, and federal patent filings were just a personal grievance. I immediately called Marcus, my longtime mentor and the firm's chief financial officer, whom I had trusted for a decade. Don't sign anything yet, Marcus reassured me over the phone. Let me inspect the deal structure first. For a moment, I breathed a sigh of relief. But 3 days later, I walked into a high-end steakhouse downtown and saw Marcus sitting in a corner booth with Brandon. They were clinking glasses. A heavy leather contract binder sat between them. Marcus followed me out to the parking lot. He didn't even bother denying it. Brandon had offered him a multi-million-dollar executive VP position in the new conglomerate if the deal went through. You knew what they were doing to me, I said quietly, the disappointment cutting deeper than I expected. Marcus looked down at his leather shoes. I know where the momentum is, Teresa. Don't fight the tide. That night, I hired Claire Sterling, one of the top IP litigation attorneys in California. She reviewed my original licensing contract, tapped a specific paragraph, and looked up at me. Your family can sell their shares, their offices, their brand, and their trucks, Claire said smoothly. But they cannot transfer or sell your core patents to Global Energy Dynamics without your signature. What happens if I refuse to sign? I asked. Claire leaned back in her chair with a sharp smile. Then they are selling a $60 billion wrapper with absolutely nothing inside it. That was the moment my mindset shifted completely. I stopped expecting my family to show loyalty, and I began preparing for war. Over the next month, they systematically pushed me out. Meetings vanished from my schedule. My access to high-level servers was restricted. Then Dad called me into his corner office and slid a single piece of paper across his desk. $100,000, he said flatly. A clean severance package, no drama. It was a total surrender contract, demanding I resign, waive all future royalties, and sign over my patents for a fraction of a percent of their worth. I looked him dead in the eye. You want my life's work for $100,000? Dad's jaw hardened. I want you to stop acting like this company revolves around your ego. I didn't argue. I handed the paper to Claire, who formally rejected the severance through legal channels. In response, my mother launched a subtle whisper campaign within the company, telling board members that I was suffering from burnout and unstable under pressure. Then came the pre-acquisition gala at the Silicon Valley Country Club. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and elite tech investors. Brandon was in his element, holding court near the stage, taking full credit for the AI algorithm while Mom beamed beside him. When an assistant brought over the technical presentation folders, Brandon noticed a tiny formatting error on the cover page and decided to make an example out of her in front of the room. If engineering can't even print a clean document, maybe we need to replace the entire back-end team, Brandon announced loudly with a dismissive chuckle. I stepped straight out of the crowd. That presentation came from my lab team, Brandon. If you have an issue with the engineering, speak to me. His smug smile vanished. You really can't stand letting anyone else have the spotlight for one night, can you? Before I could reply, he casually tipped his wineglass forward. The dark Cabernet spilled completely across the front of my white blazer, soaking through the fabric. The room went dead silent. Brandon widened his eyes in fake horror. Oh, Teresa, I am so sorry. My hand slipped. I looked at Dad. He stared down into his glass, ignoring it. I looked at Mom. She leaned in and whispered coldly, "Don't you dare make a scene here." Something inside me went completely still and icy cold. I walked to the restroom, cleaned the stain as best I could, pulled out my phone, and called Claire. "Execute the formal notice," I said. "We're shutting it down." The next morning, Claire officially notified Global Energy Dynamics that the core technology powering Vance Cleantech was encumbered by unassigned patents and that no transfer consent had been granted. Yet, my father pushed forward anyway, convinced that a $60 billion buyout made him invincible. He scheduled the final signing ceremony in the main boardroom. They had no idea that when I walked into that room, I was carrying the one legal key that would tear their entire empire to the ground. The silence in the boardroom was suffocating. Arthur Vance, the lead buyer from Global Energy Dynamics, stood motionless at the head of the table, his hand resting on the closed leather folder. My father's face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. "What do you mean the deal hasn't closed, Arthur? The contracts are sitting right here." "The funds have been frozen," Arthur replied flatly, his voice echoing in the vast room. "Because as of 8 a.m. this morning, my legal team received a formal notice of unassigned intellectual property. We have a fatal ownership defect." My father turned on me, his eyes wild. "What did you do?" Claire Sterling stepped forward smoothly, placing a heavy blue binder onto the glass table. "Teresa did nothing except exercise her legal rights as the sole owner of the core battery balancing patents. She has formally declined to transfer her property to your buyer." Brandon shot out of his executive chair, slamming his hands onto the table. "This is insane. She works for us. The company owns everything built in that lab." "Correction," Claire said, opening the binder to a notarized document from 8 years ago. The company was granted an exclusive operational license. The original patents, thermal algorithms, and foundational code were registered independently under Teresa Vance's name prior to corporate deployment. Under paragraph 14B of your own licensing agreement, any change of corporate control voids the license unless Teresa signs a written transfer consent. Arthur Vance looked directly at me. "Miss Vance, did you sign that consent?" I looked him dead in the eye. "No, and I never will." Brandon's face turned ghostly pale. My father scrambled to salvage the narrative, his voice trembling with forced authority. "Arthur, please, this is just a minor family dispute. Teresa is upset because Brandon was named CEO. We can handle this internally." Claire slid another document across the table. It was the $100,000 severance offer my father had tried to force on me weeks earlier. "Is this how you handle internal disputes?" Claire asked quietly. "Attempting to terminate the primary patent holder before closing, while attempting to coerce her into surrendering tens of billions in IP for a fraction of a percent of its value?" Arthur read the document once, then looked up at my father with absolute disgust. "You tried to sell us an empire built on technology you didn't even own, and you attempted to trick the inventor into signing it away?" "That's not what happened," my mother interjected, her voice shrill as she dropped her porcelain cup. "It is exactly what happened," I said, standing up from my seat. Brandon took a desperate step toward Arthur. "We can bypass the algorithm. We can rewrite the code in 6 months. Arthur let out a cold, dismissive laugh. Bypass the core patent of the entire clean tech industry? You don't even know how the math works, Brandon. Your sister built this entire company while you stood on stages pretending it was yours. Arthur signaled to his legal team, who immediately packed up their laptops and folders. The acquisition of Vance Clean Tech is officially terminated, Arthur declared. No funds will be wired. Global Energy Dynamics is walking away. Arthur, wait, my father begged, taking a step forward. It's $60 billion. It was $60 billion, Arthur corrected coldly as he walked out the door. Now it's just an empty building with expensive rent. Brandon collapsed back into his chair, staring blankly at the table as $60 billion evaporated into thin air. My father turned to me, his hands shaking with fury. You destroyed us. You destroyed your own family. I didn't destroy anything, Dad, I replied quietly, picking up my worn blue notebook from the table. I didn't steal your money. I didn't breach a single contract. I simply stopped letting you sell me along with the company. I walked out of the boardroom, leaving my family sitting in the silent ruins of their own greed. The aftermath didn't happen overnight, but the collapse was total. Without the rights to my core patents, Vance Clean Tech was stripped of its high market valuation. News of the failed buyout broke across Silicon Valley, triggering an immediate panic among investors. Lenders called in their loans, board members resigned, and within 4 months, the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy restructuring. My father was forced to step down in disgrace, his reputation as a business mastermind completely shattered. My mother tried to launch another PR campaign to paint me as the bitter daughter who destroyed her family. But the public court filings and contract logs told the real story. For the first time in her life, she couldn't edit the narrative. Brandon faced a formal board inquiry over unauthorized tech access attempts and was quietly blacklisted from executive positions across California. 6 months after the boardroom showdown, I co-founded Aura Energy Labs alongside a team of brilliant, dedicated engineers. We didn't need $60 billion to start. We had the original technology, full patent ownership, and an unshakable foundation built on real integrity. One evening, as I stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new San Jose headquarters, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my mother, asking if I could assist with my father's mounting legal and medical bills. I looked at the blue notebook resting on my desk, the same notebook they had dismissed for 8 years, and replied calmly through my attorney, setting up direct medical coverage without ever reopening the door to their toxic circle. I used to think loyalty meant staying silent while others took credit for your light. I was wrong. True strength isn't about fighting for a seat at a toxic table. It's about knowing what you own, standing your ground, and building your own table from scratch.